Historical Events of the 20th Century. The senior class of the Diana Seminary were assembled in the auditorium, listening in a trance of respectful attention to Professor Cielo Allinson. He had just begun his review of the historical events of the 20th century, now and then giving his individual comments upon the subjects presented. 1900. An era of false prosperity. With the beginning of the 20th century was inaugurated an era of false prosperity. The Census Bureau at that time furnishes statistics and comments upon the wonderfully perceptible decrease of the criminal classes, called footpads, sneak thieves, and highwaymen, which was attributed chiefly to the existing national prosperity. It overlooks the fact, however, that a new species of miscreants, comparatively more dangerous, had begun to thrive like mushrooms in prolific numbers. That of so-called commercial brigands, or financial buccaneers, who, under fascinating and attractive names, such as mining syndicates with their fabulous deposits of gold, offering bucketfuls of shares for a dime, banking and building loan associations, with palatial homes thrown in gratis to every subscriber, promoters of illusory inventions, seeking shareholders which would make them millions in the twinkling of an eye, alchemists who, with their artful empirics of legerdemain, transmuted base metals into gold and were willing to dispose of their precious wares for pennies, Wall Street and racetrack spiders posing as benevolent philanthropists, scattering fortunes right and left to every applicant, sapped the avaricious, sottish public of its dearly bought earnings. Strange to say, despite many colossal exposures and failures, as these adroit swindlers grew more subtle and audacious, the more the gambling-crazed public rushed to their destruction. The effect was appalling. In consequence of the depredations of these pirates of industry, the reputable business and financial firms were the greatest sufferers. Their legitimate transactions were paralyzed to such a tremendous degree that they were compelled to devise ways and means to counteract its evils. In 1908, after mature deliberation at a general convention in Washington, it was decided to raise ample funds and create a bureau under the auspices of the federal government called the Bureau of Frauds and Swindlers. The duties imposed upon its officers were the ferreting out and prosecuting of the wildcat schemes and to warn the public against them. The measure, being approved by the national government, had the desired effect of freeing to a great degree the financial world from its parasites of industrial malefactors, and to some extent established again the stability and integrity of honorable financiers, in the meanwhile safeguarding foolish persons from being fleeced out of their savings. 1902. The Cataclysm at Martinique. Saint Pierre, Martinique was destroyed by a volcanic eruption of Mount Pelée on the 8th day of May. In a few minutes, more than 30,000 human beings were hurled into eternity. 1908. The Mormon Question. The anti-plural wives' laws were enforced to the letter. Its emphatic application to all members of the sect was brought about principally by the women's clubs, whose persistent and overwhelming aggressiveness played an important factor in the stamping out of this demoralizing and materialistic religion. In this era of civilization, The existence of a religious organization of this character, like a cancerous growth, was threatening to debase womanhood and lead the communities to unbridled licentiousness. 1909. Capital and Labor. Every new movement, be it religious, political, or economic, has its birth like a volcano, and unionism was no exception to this rule. The labor unions at first had their violent agitators who, possessing greater physical than mental caliber, laid the crude foundation of a force in an arbitrary manner that consequently had its gradual evolution of development. Their constant conflicts with capital were characterized by an unreasonable amount of physical argument, which resulted in more or less disastrous denouements. But these very acts of lawlessness and disturbances awakened a third party, the consumers in general, who were equally affected by the disturbances between capital and labor, and brought about a realization of the true relative positions. Labor certainly had its unalienable rights and was entitled to due consideration and justice. However, like the negative and positive poles of electricity, which are both essential in order that a circuit of effective force be generated, capital and labor likewise had their dual relative values of importance, without which there could be no constancy of harmonious production. By the gradual awakening of both capital and labor to their true limitations, the questions involved began to assume a more intelligent basis under the codes of arbitration. At the same time, the violent agitators of labor were succeeded in the trend of this onward development by more intelligent organizers. These latter were merged into accomplished, rational leaders, and through the efficient medium of the ballot box, into national representatives. Consequently, the more dignified, orderly, and responsible labor became, the more the workers became entitled to the benefits of their labor. A department of capital and labor which, so far, had been merely probationary, now became a permanent institution at the capital and in every state of the Union as well. 1910. The expense of living. It is one of the strangest inconsistencies of social problems that although political economists and scholars have preached the doctrine that inventions and improved methods and mechanical lines contribute to the blessings of mankind by cheapening the necessities of life, yet in spite of their plausible declarations, the cost of living year by year grew higher and higher, entailing untold suffering and despair among the poorer classes. The cause of this lamentable perversion was due to a certain clique of unscrupulous progeny of Mammon, called trusts and corporations, who, being blinded with an insatiable desire for pelf and lust, and stupefied with a frenzied avarice, monopolized all the necessities of life. The vast occidental domain of our country was of unlimited resources, and was capable of producing in abundance the products which they cornered. The modus operandi of their rapacious operations were manifold. They limited the output of nature's bounty in order to keep them at prohibitive values, and at the same time deprived hosts of sons of toil of earning their livelihood. They kept at their inoperative mercy, by their abominable tactics of purchase, the producer from receiving his just share, and they also mulcted the helpless consumer by the unlimited inflation of their capital stock and fictitious expenses, until at length the burden of their avarice became unendurable, Although attempts have repeatedly been made by sincere executives of the nation, by the advocation of measures for curbing the rapacity of these trusts, their endeavors met with failure on account of the vague and flexible laws already in existence, and by the array of sycophantic traders in high circles who prevented any legislation which was conducive to the tranquility and welfare of the masses. At last, only after a series of sanguinary demonstrations by the people, which almost endangered the stability of the Republic, they were compelled to yield. By the passage of clearly defined laws, the career of their nefarious system of exploitation was brought to an end. One of the most efficacious laws passed was the creation of a body of competent men of supreme power who appraised approximately the capitalization of these concerns and licensed them as such under oath. The states, in the meantime, assumed the power of fixing a maximum value for their commodities which might be placed on the market. By the above legislations, the inflation of their capital and extortion from the consumer were made securely impossible. 1911. Death of an eminent scholar. Professor Henry Richfield, a profound scholar and the author of How to Get Rich, a ponderous work in 12 octavo volumes, passed away in an attic, in abject penury and squalor. 1912. The annihilation of mosquitoes. Although the mortality statistics in the United States for last year reached the round number of 2 million persons from various diseases, among them chiefly from consumption, pneumonia, typhoid fever, and epidemics of smallpox and diphtheria, a few sporadic cases of death were recorded resulting from mosquito bites, which gave grave concern to the medical fraternity. The outcome of this alarm was the calling of a general conference of bacteriological experts. The mosquito, that had hitherto enjoyed unbridled freedom since the creation of his race, was now looked upon as the arch-enemy of mankind. A noted philanthropist, interested in oil wells and having on hand a great bulk of unmarketable crude petroleum, donated a large sum for research in order to discover ways and means of curbing the ravages of these nefarious pests, which threatened the annihilation of the human race. It was decided by the savants that the distribution of crude petroleum in stagnant pools and humid marshes was the only effective method for the extermination of mosquito life. The distribution of greenbacks for their valuable services, notwithstanding the fact that under the microscope they were found to contain 257 diseases and 38 million microbes to the square inch, were grabbed with unprecedented avidity by these same specialists. 1913. Child labor. The dwarfing and crippling of the mental, moral, and physical growth of tender children by the avaricious employers, and its baleful consequences of peopling the community with moral and bodily degenerates, devoid of the desirable elements of good citizenship, had become so appallingly flagrant that a general sentiment of the people was aroused in a mighty protest to the federal authorities. Thanks to the aggressive and strenuous legislative warfare of labor unions in every state, aided by the persistent moral agitation of women's clubs all over the country, child labor was entirely abolished in many channels of industry, such as mills, factories, collieries, and plantations. In more gentle occupations, the employment of minors was placed on a healthier and more humane basis than had ever before been the case. 1914. The Great Radium Swindle. The fabulously high price of this metal had awakened the cupidity of a coterie of adroit schemers, who had palmed off on unsuspecting men of science a rank substitute which cost only a trifle to manufacture. After securing an enormous sum of money, the schemers had decamped to parts unknown. It was discovered that the spurious metal, thus disposed, was nothing more than a highly compressed form of phosphorus. 1915. Death of an eminent physician. Dr. Weishart, the brilliant young physician and surgeon who discovered the electromagnetic germ cells of life and invented methods to prolong life itself by the cultivation of these cells, died in the 27th year of his age, from premature senility. 1916. A tidal wave. The most memorable event of this year was a gigantic tidal wave of tremendous height, which swept over the lower coast of Florida. In a few minutes, it inundated and destroyed a vast area of the coast, doing incalculable damage to shipping. It was estimated that nearly 15,000 persons lost their lives in this cataclysm. 1917. War between United States and Colombia. The stubborn attitude of the Central American Republic, Colombia, towards the United States by her menacing antagonism to the construction of the Interoceanic Canal gradually created a breach of the peace that led ultimately to a forcible demonstration by the United States and precipitated the invasion by the latter of the Republic of Panama. Peace was reestablished after a crushing defeat of the Colombians. The famous waterway, the Republic of Panama, then became United States territory by annexation. 1918. The Women's Clubs. The women's clubs, which during their first inception were the subject of much ridicule, and the proceedings of their meetings a theme for ribald jokes in the secular press, gradually developed into such gigantic proportions that their influence became a powerful factor in every public question of the day, and in fact so continues unabated unto this day. The last federal statistics show more than 2,000 institutions in the form of sanitariums, refuges, technical schools of practical utility, entirely under the auspices of club women. The constitutions of these laudable organizations invariably stand for something which is ennobling, and their achievements are monumental tributes to the upward trend of womanhood. There was, however, a crucial period in their affairs worth mentioning. Some of these noble but overzealous women of that period, in their exuberant enthusiasm for women's rights, forgetting the limitations of their sex, considered by the greatest thinkers of the past ages to be the sphere of home, agitated a propaganda of political equality and suffrage, and, from time to time, created a stir among their organizations until at last, in 1918, the National Federation of Women's Clubs decided to hold a conclave in order to decide the following momentous question: should women enter politics? More than 4,500 delegates from all over the Union assembled at Madison Square Garden in New York City. Sympathizers of the suffragists, with their eloquence, tried to railroad through a measure in their behalf, but equally able leaders of the opposition, benefited by the warning of the sages, succeeded in counterbalancing the efforts of their fair antagonists. After a heated symposium, the question was put to a vote, which resulted decisively in a victory for those who opposed the movement. It was further voted that they should confine all their energies to civic, educational, and humanitarian channels, and things pertaining to home. This was a most happy and wise decision, for the world at large needs mothers who will beget and nurse a Florence Nightingale, a Clara Barton, a Washington, or a Lincoln, rather than mothers who would become a Jezebel, a Delilah, or a Cleopatra. 1919. The Tornado. A cyclonic tornado of intense velocity and destructive force struck New York City, demolishing in its path in the shape of a semicircle from the Battery to 33rd Street West 275 buildings. Fortunately, the day being a holiday, the loss of life was comparatively small. 1920. The Power of the Press. Through emancipation from its shackles of monarchic censorship and subserviency to despotic masters, the upward rise of the press to usefulness and power was without a parallel, a power to which even Napoleon Bonaparte was sensible when he said, "I fear 3 newspapers more than 100,000 bayonets." But like everything else in the universe, the press also had its dual personality. Like a two-edged sword, it could be wielded for good or evil. In the bands of an unscrupulous politician, it was a treacherous weapon, while in the control of the righteous citizen, a tremendous power of good. Thus the press for many decades, subsidized by the traitorous capitalist and under the guise of a pious mask, catered to the evil designs of the plutocracy until the gradual awakening of the people, through the independent press, at last understood their hypocrisy. The independent press, however, attained its highest degree of efficiency by the establishment of the College of Journalism. Its foundation slogan, "Publicity on all political and economic questions," had created a force of trained journalists, a force mightier than the sword, and in a manner far more penetrating than the X-ray, pledged to defend the rights of the citizens. By an educational propaganda, it taught the masses how to eradicate existing evils by the mere exercising of their unalienable right, the ballot box. Indeed, in a government of the people, for the people, and by the people, resort to force or revolution was absolutely unnecessary, while these two most effectual weapons the world had ever seen, the voting booth and the free press, were at their command. 1921. Balloons and airships. Strange to say, from the time of Archytas of Tarentum to Otto Lilienthal, and from Montgolfier brothers to Santos Dumont, Bell, Maxim, and Langley, very little or no progress has been made in practical and safe aerial navigation. Though all these inventors, whether cranks with a smattering of mechanical knowledge, or veritable savants and scientists, efficient in physics according to their own accounts, had studied the subject of aerial flight from the fowls of the air, the failure of their experiments showed that they were far from grasping the mysteries of that subtle sagacity and subconsciousness of the birds, by which they balanced themselves against the currents and velocity of the winds, and by their intuitive sensitiveness utilized to the fullest extent their vast numbers of muscles and feathers with such marvelous subtlety. Like the Italian alchemist in the Middle Ages, who had constructed the wings of his flying machine with feathers gathered from a dunghill, and who, when attempting to fly, had found himself dumped by a strange sympathetic affinity on the very dunghill from which he had gathered the feathers, The efforts likewise of these illustrious experimenters were crowned by successful failures by a similar force of attraction, their apparatus either alighting on the branches of trees or diving into the waters like ducks. At the beginning of the 20th century, the consensus on scientific opinion had reached the conclusion that the successful flying machines of the future would be one which would be heavier than air and with either a very small balloon or none at all. The various forms of balloons and flying craft exhibited at the St. Louis Exposition became an incentive for renewed efforts by scientists to solve the problem of aerial flight, and continued with unremitting zest for nearly a quarter of a century. It was in the early part of 1919 that the science of aeronautics was radically improved by the discovery of a process for hardening and soldering of aluminum, by which comparatively light but strong framework and machinery were constructed, and thus gradually the elimination of inflated balloons had become possible. 1922. The flood in Mississippi Valley. In the spring of this year, the Mississippi Valley was flooded and submerged by terrible cloudbursts, which, combined with melting of snows on the mountains and subsequent bursting of dams and levees, devastated a vast area. According to records, the lives lost in the inundated districts reached the total of 60,000. 1923. Uniform divorce laws. The unprecedented increase of divorce all over the United States and the attendant scandalous proceedings at the courts had reached such a maximum, and its baneful influence on the public morals had developed into such a point of danger, that a great awakening among the clergy and lawmakers of the nation was the result. At a conclave of representatives of the legal profession from every state in the Union was promulgated a uniform divorce law for the United States of America. 1924. The Zionist movement, or the bursting of the Zion bubble. The Zionist movement, which for 30 years past gained more than 2 million converts, and within that period had collected more than $15 million, was declared impractical and illusionary. The estimable originators of this sentimental movement, Herzl, Nordau, Zangwill, and others, although beyond the shadow of a doubt sincere and well-meaning, through the intensity of their zeal for the amelioration of their less fortunate brethren, were entirely blindfolded to the intricacies of politics and the eventual history of the Jewish race from an ethnological and psychological point of view. Some of these true yet misguided philanthropists had passed away, and other leaders, less impressed with the object of the society, had taken their places. As the Jews are not a pioneer race, the magnanimous scheme of the British government to place them upon a tract of virgin soil at Uganda in Central Africa for the purpose of colonization proved chaotic failure, on account of both sociological and economic reasons. The idea also of establishing a Jewish principality in Palestine, under an absolute despotic and semi-barbarous government, which butchered her subjects ad libitum, was so ridiculous in the extreme that the questions had become the laughingstock at the political sancta sanctorums of various governments. In 1923, a tremendous agitation was brought about by the leaders of the opposition, and those in power of the movement were challenged to public debate. The question grew to such proportions that it became a subject in every Orthodox and Gentile pulpit. In the press, sociologists, ethnologists, and anthropologists took part in the ephemeral arena and analyzed every phase of the subject relating to the Hebrew race and the Zionist movement, laying bare every fact without reserve. It was stated by the opposition that though a stream of money had been pouring in from every quarter of the globe, year after year, for the cause, no result as yet had been obtained, that great sums had been spent in salaries of the officials and at the dilly-dallying, corrupt courts of the Turkish Sultan. A learned sociologist likened the Hebrews to a parasitic plant, which derived its existence from the living sap of another. An Israelite, he declared, can only exist favorably among civilized centers of Christian and Gentile communities. That whenever a colony of Hebrews were isolated by themselves, they would inevitably and gradually retrograde, impoverish, and at last form a ghetto of misery and squalor. Another ethnologist of repute expounded the fact that the Jews were the life and essence of commercial activity, and consequently formed an integral part of a prosperous commonwealth. Sublimely industrious, instinctively provident, and economical by nature, the Jews were persecuted because of their inherent virtues. He proved by clever historical documents that their expulsion from Babylon, Egypt, Spain, Russia, or wherever their rights were abrogated, were the fundamental causes of the decadence of these countries from which they were expelled. Others accused the Hebrews of perverting the golden rule, of taking advantage of others and their inborn instinct of commercial sagacity, which well nigh approached unscrupulousness, and that, being a mere commercial people, their patriotism could well be challenged. Many others advised, however, a propaganda of judicious assimilation of the Israelite with the Christians, contending that the sum total of their virtues and faults was the same as that of their Christian brethren. Meanwhile, they advised the Jews that, wherever they lived, they ought to make there their Zions and temples. After much heated argument and discussion, which occupied several days, they at last arrived at the conclusion that the Zionist movement was chimerical. The balance of the funds, amounting to many $1,000,000, were voted for the establishment of technical and commercial schools for Israelites, and for a fund to aid the judicious immigration of the Jews from ill-favored and contested districts to more favorable localities. 1925 to 26. The Anglo-American Alliance. The Anglo-American Alliance, by which these two foremost nations of the earth were brought into a happy fraternal union, and for the achievement of which for nearly a quarter of a century there had been a great effort, in this year had become an accomplished fact. It was celebrated in a manner unprecedented in the annals of the world's history. Having a profound and far-reaching effect, it became an ultimatum for other nations to keep the peace, and goaded them toward the adoption of similar laws in order to secure the same reciprocal blessings of universal brotherhood. Much credit was due to that eminent English statesman, now Lord Cunningham, through whose tactful diplomacy this long-sought commercial, social, offensive, and defensive alliance became a reality. "I am restrained," said the professor, looking in the direction of Aurora Cunningham, "to avoid eulogizing him as he justly deserves, for obvious reasons." At this sentence, the students, under the impulse of a sudden admiration, arose to their feet en masse, and glancing smilingly at Aurora, began rapturously to clap their hands. The interruption of sympathetic appreciation was brought to a close by a ringing cry of the seminary yell, "Dee, dee, ya, ya, na, na, Diana! Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah!" Aurora, blushing deeply, gracefully bowed her acknowledgment, and in due form the class was dismissed for the day. Historical events of the 20th century concluded. A subdued applause greeted the professor the next day when he entered the lecture room to conclude his review of events of the 20th century. Many floral bouquets were tossed to him by his fair admirers, who were augmented from the other classes, on account of the full detail of his encounter with Don Seville having been spread throughout the seminary. The professor, despite some discoloration on his benign visage, flushed crimson like a bashful child, and bowed his acknowledgments as he began his discourse thus. 1927. Colonization of Central Africa. A system of general colonization on a large scale was, during this year, undertaken by the British government. By a new homestead law embodying liberal inducements, a vast army of colonists from all over the British dominions were transported to Central Africa. Thousands upon thousands of persons from congested districts of London, Glasgow, Liverpool, and other large cities were persuaded to leave their limited surroundings and uncongenial atmosphere and go to the promising new land teeming with boundless opportunities. Almost the entire inhabitants of the isolated islands of the Shetlands and Orkneys, who led an indolent life and eked a meager existence by fisheries, joined this grand trek to Central Africa. Many thousands from the Canadian provinces and from the United States of America joined the exodus, as did also thousands from the East Indies. The thorough and admirable manner in which this laudable movement was handled mitigated the hardships of transportation, and thus within a few years more than 5 million poor, homeless, and indolent people were given homesteads of their own, awakening them into energy and thrift. Within a decade, the population of Central Africa reached the grand total of 25 million industrious, loyal citizens, forming a flourishing dependency, enjoying home rule and liberty under the protection of the British laws and arms. 1928. The conflagration of the Atlantic Ocean. One of the most wonderful and at the same time awful conflagrations of its kind on record in the history of the world was that of the apparent burning of the Atlantic Ocean, covering an area 150 miles wide. It started in the Gulf of Mexico, and, like a prairie fire, only 1,000 times more furious, this floating furnace consumed scores of vessels that came into its fiery path. A few weeks previous to this awful holocaust, the petroleum wells in Texas, New Mexico, and Louisiana had run dry on account of severe earthquakes. It was argued by scientists that, by some subterranean convulsions, the oil well fissures had shifted their course into the waters of the Gulf, and the vast accumulation of the inflammable fluid floating on the ocean had been ignited, either by an electric spark during a thunderstorm or by some combustible being thrown from a sailing craft. 1929. The Court of Labor. In this year was completed and dedicated the Court of Labor at Washington. This was an imposing building, in which all the momentous labor problems were discussed before a tribunal of disinterested justices. Through the able representatives of each faction, without resorting to disastrous strikes, lockouts, and disturbances of public comfort. One of the most remarkable features of this court of arbitration was the colossal group erected between the two grand entrances to the building. This was not a semi-nude female figure with bandaged eyes, holding in her hand the conventional pair of scales, but a Herculean figure of Uncle Sam with his starry hat and glorious chin whiskers, having 3 faces, 3 eyes, and 3 arms. Before him were a group of 3 figures which represented respectively capital, consumer, and labor. In each figure were his eyes wide open and alert, bent with searching scrutiny upon the person in front, to whom he dispensed the just share of each from a huge cornucopia at his feet. 1930. Landlordism in America. One of the most scandalous evils which had crept gradually in the United States and eventually became a source of grave anxiety to the government was a system of landlordism amongst the very rich. While the general public were slumbering in blissful ignorance, this coterie of avaricious syndicates and multimillionaires had mysteriously become possessors of vast tracts of lands in every state of the Union. Some of these holdings comprised hundreds and thousands of square miles in extent, miles and miles of shore fronts, immense areas of forests, whole mountains and lakes. Through the conniving, corrupt state and county officials had passed into the hands of private individuals who, in return, had become extremely arrogant in their treatment of the public by unreasonable restriction. There seemed to be a mocking sarcasm in the fact when common people sang the national anthem America, celebrating its hills and rills, while at every turn of the road, at every shore front, lake, hill and valley, mountain and forests, the forbidding sign, "No trespassing under penalty," met their eyes, or the repulsive muzzle of the Winchester was thrust into their faces by private watchmen. This state of affairs had reached such desperate straits that the public suddenly awakened on the subject. It started first by the protest of the rougher element in the mountain districts, who defied the hired authorities with an organized force. The people committed acts of violence and incendiarism, it is true, but by their overt acts they awakened the dormant public to realize the enormity of this scandalous condition of deedling away to millionaires without the consent of the Commonwealth, the common and inalienable heritage of its citizens. By a unanimous uprising and public mandate, the federal and state authorities were compelled to condemn and confiscate these stolen public lands. New laws were then enacted by which the acquiring of extensive lands was limited, except for agricultural purposes. 1931. The discovery of the North Pole. The North Pole, that mysterious geographical locality which for centuries had baffled scientists and explorers, was located and verified by the combined efforts of American and British governments. The expedition was on a gigantic scale, the force of the explorers being in round numbers 2,500 persons, who, by a system of depots and rendezvous for supplies, formed almost a continuous chain. All the latest devices in the form of dynamo vans and motor sleds with balloon attachments were employed in the undertaking. Strange to say, the casualties did not exceed more than 10% of the expeditionary force. It was discovered, to the great surprise of scientists, that the locality was nothing more than a plateau studded with cones of ice. 1932. Cure for laziness. The discovery by an American of a germicide for indolence was announced during this year, by which lethargic persons were regenerated into acute activity. It was a concentrated double extract of pitch blende, containing the radioactive element, and when applied to certain parts of the body, it instantaneously transformed the feeling of laziness and ennui into one of hustling energy and alertness, The Negroes of the southern states, the natives of tropical countries, and also officials in the police departments of large cities were the ones benefited by this golden medical discovery. 1933. Capital punishment. The abolishment of capital punishment in many states of the Union, through the impulsive sentimentality of a minority, had given birth to an old-time evil, that of feudalism. It was well for people preaching mercy for murderers when somebody else was the victim, but when the crime was perpetrated against one of their homes, their feelings were entirely changed. The increase of vendetta was the result, and it occurred with such a lamentable degree of frequency that the old uncontrovertible Mosaic law, blood for blood and life for life, was reestablished. 1934. Abolition of hereditary titles in England. The agitation for the abolition of hereditary titles in England caused a crisis in the political and social world of Great Britain. The degeneracy of hereditary nobles, their utter incapability adequately to fill the positions left by their illustrious ancestors, to the detriment and retrogression of the British government, was the main cause of bringing about this bloodless internecine revolution. Despite the most strenuous opposition by the friends of the nobles, a new law was added to the revised Magna Carta by an overwhelming public demand. With few exceptions, it nullified the existing title and elevated to peerage only worthy citizens for life, on condition of the good behavior of the incumbent. This excellent law brought fresh and saving blood into the political and civic life of England. The movement precipitated the abandonment of the House of Lords, and created in its stead a body called Senatorium, whose members were elected by the tax-paying citizens. 1935. Blowing the earth into fragments. The most remarkable sensation of this year was that of a German scientist and statistician who, after a thorough investigation and mathematical calculation, announced his conclusions that it was in the range of human power, that is, by the combined aid of labor, time, money, and high explosives, to rend the earth in twain or into fragments, and thus create new planets in space, producing new climatic conditions, fauna, and life, adaptable to their positions in the solar system. 1937. An American penal colony. The census of this year revealed an unprecedented number of evildoers, causing great anxiety to the government. There were recorded 92,000 criminals in prisons and 76,000 paupers in the poorhouses. This army of public charges cost the state authorities more than $30 million for their maintenance. At last, by the stress of popular agitation, the government adopted a policy of penal colonization. Selecting a desirable island in the Philippines, the federal authorities succeeded in transporting to the island within 3 years, and with half the cost of their maintenance at home, 1,000 of these unfortunate malefactors. Here they were given every facility and aid for acquiring and building of homes, farms, and factories, and within 10 years, under a wise military administration, more than half of that number were reclaimed, forming a prosperous and loyal community in the Eastern Hemisphere. 1938. The Great Telescope. With the munificent contributions to a general fund, amounting to $2 million by the English, American, and French governments, the greatest telescope which the world had ever known was constructed in Paris, Its lenses measured more than 2 meters in diameter, which, combined with a mammoth revolving camera obscura, brought the moon and some of the planets within the range of visual observation, revealing on Venus and Mars the existence of vegetation and moving objects. 1939. The Earth, an Electric Motor. Emile Flammarion, the worthy grandson of the eminent French astronomer, demonstrated by an extremely clever mechanical contrivance in vacuo that the Earth was merely an electric motor in space. 1940. The trend of religious thought. Religious thought or spiritual belief is not an invention of morals. It is an inborn attribute of the human mind. While man was in his savage or semi-barbarous stage, the ethical and spiritual conceptions were correspondingly crude, and religious warfare predominated. With the advance of civilization, its development kept pace with it, until at the dawn of the 20th century it had undergone, by natural evolution, a marked metamorphosis. It gradually divested itself of its legendary mysticism, fantastic dogma, and spectacular schisms. With all intelligent thinkers promulgated a propaganda, not of external forms of worship, but those uncontrovertible basic truths which always will hold. It is true that in an era of commercial materialism, great masses of people embraced agnosticism and ethical culture, rejecting that supernatural conception of a first cause, of which they claimed their limited intellect had a vague idea and was deeper than the hazy human comprehension. Yet the shallow Ingersollian philosophy of attacking a force which filled millions with hope and goaded them to self-sacrifice, mercy, and charity, without substituting something better, was repudiated by the intelligent and appealed only to the abnormal and the foolish. The tendency of materialism in religion continued unabated until the startling announcement of a German scientist who claimed it was within human power to rend the world in twain. Also the marvelous revelation through the mammoth telescope by which was discovered moving objects in vegetation in other planets, brought an acute crisis. A tremendous religious revival swept over all the world. It expanded the mental horizon of human conceptions. The existence of living organisms in other spheres came within rational deductions. The possible existence of beings far superior in intellect to ourselves came within the limit of legitimate theorizations, and the more men began to grasp with the cooperations of science the infinite vastness of the universe with its numberless millions of inhabitable worlds, the probability of an intelligent force of vast creative power came within the scope of human understanding. The forceful passage in the Holy Writ that God created man in his own image became more and more lucid. Consequently, the pantheism of the old Greeks were revived with more clearness, and the existence of a personal God somewhere in this boundless universe appealed to multitudes with new zest. "Pray, Professor, what is your opinion of a first cause?" ventured one of the students. "There are so many mysterious forces," answered the professor, "that although we cannot see, yet we feel their power and are conscious of their results. And as our moral organism cannot conceive a thought which is beyond its own limitations, the very idea of our thought of a first cause falls within the range of human conception. When we gaze at an automobile, which is the creation of a creature, we see a wonderful parallelism. Its requirements to make it an active energy bears a strong analogy of its inventor. Yet an automobile with its requirements for power supplied is a worthless mass unless operated and guided by its creator. Does not this vast universe, with all its wonderful manifestations, suggest a creative force which governs it? Albeit it is not within my province nor in my power to penetrate the veil, continued the professor, looking in a pensive mood. But as the coral protoplasm begins its edifice from the calcareous mire and the dark recesses of the ocean, upwards through the murky and semi-transparent liquid, finally reaches the pellucid surface, kisses the wave and sees the light, methinks likewise the spiritual perceptions of mankind, which has grown from the depths of savagery and through the maze of intolerance, dogmas, and schisms, will go onward in its evolution, and perhaps our prosperity will at last penetrate the mystic veil and see the light, God. 1941. The birthday anniversary of noted centenarians. Lithia Bingham, young Dr. Bray, and Sister Etty received the homage and congratulations of millions of their admirers on their 150th birthday anniversary. The remarkable longevity of this trio of Methuselahs was attributed, in the case of the two first mentioned, to their own cure-all concoctions, and the last to her scientific revelation of thinking that there is no such thing as pain or death. In closing this review of historical events, said the professor, looking around the auditorium, there are a few other important happenings that bring us to the present decade. The remarkable decadence of Germany under a socialistic regime, a doctrine that, although theoretically seems to be so desirably altruistic, convincing, and in poetry sounds so well, but in practice has proved to be detrimental to a life of strenuous efforts and suicidal to individual ambitions, conditions which are eminently essential to growing and prosperous communities. The consequent exodus of Teutons to other parts of the world that promised freedom to individual action. The political union of Spain and Portugal. The reconquest of France by Alsace-Lorraine. The puerile uprising by a section of Irish people against England are still fresh in our memory, and to which most of you have been eyewitnesses, are some of the events worthy of record. Here the professor, after a pause, changed his subject to future possibilities, and presenting to the class in eloquent words a glowing, optimistic picture of conditions for future generations, brought his discussion to a close. When he stepped down from the rostrum, he was at once summoned by the entire class and was tendered an impromptu but agreeable reception.